Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch review, and today we're comparing two very important watches in the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak lineup. That is the extra thin, which is the reference 15202 ST, versus the 41mm Royal Oak, which is the reference 15400 ST. As with all my reviews, let's start with the history of the Royal Oak. If we go back in time now to the 1970s, specifically around 1969, so late 60s, early 70s, quartz became a really big important thing in the watch industry. Quartz basically was a different style of movement to mechanical movements. It was a battery-powered movement that was extremely accurate, had very, very low service costs, because really generally was the only thing that you needed to replace was the battery. It was very, very reliable, and really what made people love quartz watches so much back then was because it was around the time when computers and electronic things were just becoming so popular, and there was so much attention on electronic things, and mechanical things like watches were just actually not so interesting anymore. It wasn't really part of the future picture that people had for the world. So quartz was kind of like futuristic and everyone loved it. And what happened to the Swiss watch industry, the mechanical watches, as a result of that, was that they actually saw a massive hit in their sales. A lot of brands went out of business around that time because they just couldn't afford to keep up with the quartz boom. Quartz watches were much cheaper as well, a tiny fraction of the cost that Swiss watches were. So Audemars Piguet was actually one of the brands that was very much struggling around this time in the early 70s. So they knew they had to do something really special, release a very special watch in order to bring people back to the Swiss watch industry and Audemars Piguet, of course. And make people realize that the quartz watches served a really great purpose for everyday and just general use, but nothing could ever replace a Swiss watch that's completely made by hand and finished by hand. So they knew they had to create something special, but they wanted to make something with their design ideas was basically it had to be a watch that was appropriate for any occasion. It was a watch that it was possible to be your only watch, completely your only watch, something that you could wear every single day. And they enlisted the help from the famous watch designer Gerald Genta, in 1971, I believe, and they designed the watch, well, he designed the watch overnight. The Royal Oak is what he named it, and the Royal Oak was incredibly special and not been done at all before in the industry. Totally new design and concept as well for a watch. It was a steel watch, a sports watch, and it was finished to the same level that a dress watch was. So incredibly high finishing, polished and amazing attention to detail that no one had ever done on a steel sports watch until then. The watch was extremely expensive when it was released, much more so than any of the Rolex sports watches at that time, which were the industry leaders for sports watches in steel. And the reason was because the watch was so difficult to machine to that level in steel, because steel has such a high hardness rating. It's very hard to create those polished and brushed finishes and all those accents and angles by hand with steel. So that's why everyone really used precious metal for creating those sorts of finishes before. So it was incredibly difficult to do, and that's why Audemars Piguet had to charge much higher prices for that watch. And this incredibly high price over any other sports watch in the industry really scared a lot of buyers off. And then people started to realize the value in that incredible craftsmanship and the fact that it's actually just such an incredible skill that not many people can do, because it really was in a way like art. And now we're skipping on 40 years to the 40th anniversary of the Royal Oak, which is in 2012. Which is when we saw the release of both of these two watches here that we're looking at, the 15202 ST and the 15400 ST. Between that time, there were many new watches released from Audemars Piguet in the Royal Oak lineup. If you'd like to learn more in depth about how the Royal Oak came about and all the different past models, and also how the name came about and the design inspiration that Gerald Genta got for this watch, then go check out my 15202 ST, the extra thin Royal Oak, and that'll give you some much more in-depth history on this piece. Okay, so moving back to 2012. So the extra thin, the 15202, had previous models before that, but this new release 15202 in 2012 was the most true to the original design since its release in 1972. So purists absolutely loved this watch because it was just so true to the original. The watch also featured the exact same movement from the original watch, the same rotor, the same design. The dial was very, very similar to the original watch as well. So yeah, people totally fell in love with this watch when Audemars Piguet first released it in 2012. But around the same time, because it was the 40th anniversary of the Royal Oak and it was an incredibly important anniversary, Audemars Piguet wanted to release or revamp the whole Royal Oak line, not just the extra thin. So the other watch that was kind of a core part of the Royal Oak range was the slightly more affordable 15300 reference. And that one was in 39mm as well as the extra thin, so similar proportions to the extra thin. But Audemars Piguet phased that watch out. They discontinued that watch in 2012 and replaced it with two watches. The first one was the 41mm, which was the reference 15400 ST or 15400 that we're looking at here today. The reason why they released a 41mm was because around that time in 2012, there was a real trend and focus towards much bigger watches. And basically the 41mm was just a sized up version of that 39mm. It didn't have the exact same proportions, but it was very similar. And it was totally new design, totally new features on that watch, new bracelet, etc., etc. So it was a completely new watch and new model part of the range. And then to satisfy the clients who preferred the smaller style watches, they released a 37mm with the reference 15450. And that one was obviously a much smaller version, so for people with smaller wrists, that was the perfect watch for them. Moving back onto the 41mm, which is what we're looking at, when that was first released in 2012, it wasn't so well received. The reason being was because people believed the Royal Oak should always be at 39mm or less, because that was what the original design was. But it's become an incredibly popular watch, an important watch in the Audemars Piguet lineup, and the rest of the watches in the lineup now are also 41mm. It's actually only the 39mm, the extra thin, and a couple other watches that are smaller than that. The rest of them are in 41mm. Okay, so let's look at some of the features on these watches. They are quite different, even though they do at first glance look quite similar. There's actually many differences between the two of them. So we'll go through that, and we'll start, as always, with the clasp of these two watches. This is pretty difficult to show on camera, but the 15, if I turn them on the side now so you can see both bracelets next to each other, or clasps from the side, you can see that the 15202, so the extra thin, has a slightly smaller clasp than the 400. And the reason for that is the difference in bracelet, which I'll come on to. So yeah, the clasps are both very similar. I'll just use the 15202 now to just demonstrate the clasp. In my opinion, the best clasp in the industry by a long, long way. It's beautifully machined, it's incredibly solid. We've kind of got this satin finish on the inside of the clasp. Everything is very sharp and well machined. You definitely feel it's not going anywhere, it feels incredibly solid. It's a twin trigger deployment clasp, so it means you have to press in both triggers to release the clasp, which makes it much more solid and safe. Probably my favorite thing about this clasp is it's so incredibly low profile. It's also completely seamless with the design of the bracelet, and the bracelet is absolutely stunning on this watch. I'll come on to that in a second. So yeah, beautifully machined clasp, best in the industry by a long, long way. Very comfortable, very safe, and completely seamless. Doesn't stick out at all. Yeah, definitely the best one in my opinion. Moving on now to the bracelet, and the bracelets on both these watches are quite different. The 15400 is much thicker and wider than the 202 bracelet, or the extra thin bracelet. Straight away, it's pretty easy to see the difference between the two of them. The 15400 bracelet is much larger. The links are wider, the taper doesn't taper as much or as thin as the extra thin does. And as I said, also it is a little bit thicker. Each link is much thicker. I'd say almost twice to maybe 1.5 times the thickness of the extra thin bracelet. So you definitely do feel a difference in the two weights of the watches because of the thicker, bigger bracelet. It definitely feels much sportier and much more utility than the 202. I'd say probably the extra thin feels much more delicate, feels much more like a dress watch versus the 15400. Now, which of the two bracelets do I prefer? I'd have to say that I much prefer the bracelet on the 15202. I like the fact it's a little bit more delicate. I think it suits the watch a little bit better, but I do really appreciate that the 15400 is a bulkier watch, so it has to have a bulkier bracelet in order to fit the design. Just demonstrating now on the 15202, an absolutely beautifully finished bracelet on this watch, or on all Royal Oaks as well. We've got these stunning flat links, and lots of them as well, and it's an incredibly important part of the design of the Royal Oak. When it was first designed in 1972 by Giorgento, that was his selling point, that the bracelet was totally unique and never been done before. To have all these flat links means that the light shimmers off the bracelet like a diamond does with its facets. It scintillates and sparkles just the same way that a diamond does. You kind of catch the light off each bigger link, and then each plot in between the links shimmers as well. So yeah, it's just a stunning bracelet. There's nothing like it, in my opinion, the absolute best in the industry. Okay, now moving on to the case. The incredible polished little bevel edge on the bracelet is continued up onto the case on this watch, on both watches in fact, and all Royal Oaks in the range. It's a really nice feature that they've continued the same design up onto the case. Same with all the bracelet links. We've got these little plots, and then these two plots that lead up to the lugs on the watch. Really nice feature, again continuing that same beautiful design, and the taper just is perfect and seamless up into the case on both watches. Okay, so this is probably where we're going to see the biggest difference between these two watches is the case. If we turn them both over and we start at the back of the case, both of them feature clear crystal case backs, so we can see the movement inside. As you can see that the 15400 has a much smaller window or crystal than the extra thin does. We don't get to see the movement in all its glory in quite the same way that we do on the extra thin. And of course the movements are different in these two watches. The extra thin is a special movement, and the 15400 is a standard Royal Oak movement. Both of them feature a stunning 22 karat rotor for winding the movement, because these are both automatic movements, so they wind themselves, self-winding. And the actual finishing on both of these rotors is stunning. On the 15400 we have the family crest for the Audemars and Piguet families. And that's a really nice feature. I actually, in a way, slightly prefer that to the extra thin's rotor, but the extra thin rotor is skeletonized, which is in a way a little bit cooler. But yeah, really beautiful movements on both, finished to an incredible level. The incredible attention to detail you see on the outside of the watch is 100% carried through onto the internals of the watch as well, which is a wonderful thing that only really the owner of that piece will ever get to see or experience. Moving now up onto the rest of the case, and we'll kind of start from the middle plate, so the center of the Royal Oak. The actual thickness of these two watches, I'll just quickly mention as well, the extra thin is 8.1 millimeters thick, and the 15400 is 9.8 millimeters thick, so it's a much thicker watch. Almost 2 millimeters thicker. So yeah, you can definitely tell the difference between the two of them. I'll show them side by side on screen now, and you will see that obviously the 15400 is quite a bit thicker, but the difference is not insane. It's not like a Royal Oak versus an offshore. And same with all Royal Oaks, we have a full brushed case, apart from our bezel, which we'll move on to now. We've got a full brushed bezel on the top with 8 hexagonal screws, all in 18 karat white gold, same on both watches. And then around the edge of our bezel we have a polished finish, which is just such a nice accent. It adds to kind of the jewelry effect to this watch. The kind of scintillating, sparkling effect that you see from the bracelet is carried over into that beautiful octagonal bezel. It just captures the light and glimmers in such a nice way. Yeah, one of my favorite features on this watch is actually that polished bezel. And of course, the 202 is 39mm and the 15400 is 41mm. So we've got a couple mil difference in terms of size there. And it's not major when you look at them side by side when you're holding them. You can definitely tell the difference, but I'd say the biggest difference is when you put them on. When you wear them, you will definitely see a little bit of a difference. It's not insanely big. That's something that clients always ask us about when they're considering these two watches or trying to decide between these two. Is the 39mm way smaller, or is the 40mm too big? And we always say the difference is not major, but it is definitely, you will notice it. Now moving on to the dials on these two watches, we've got kind of a bit more of a polished, kind of shiny dial that on the 15400. We've got a bit more of a sunburst effect as well on the 15400. Yes, it's got a little bit more life to it. In fact, much more life than the 15202. The extra thin is quite a dull dial, quite a dead dial. It doesn't have the same sort of sparkle and special effect or finish that the 15400 has. They both feature a date function at 3 o'clock. Of course, they both feature this beautiful blue dial, but a slightly different layout in terms of where the Audemars Piguet logo is and the writing on these two watches, as you can see. And the 15400 features a seconds hand as well, which I really like. Overall, which do I prefer in terms of dial? I'd say I actually prefer the 15400 dial. I like to have the seconds hand there. I think it kind of adds a little bit of life to the watch. It kind of shows it's beating away. The 15202, of course, it's telling the time, and the time will be changing. But when you immediately glance at the watch, it's same as a chronograph. It's difficult to tell if it's alive or not, whereas the 15400, it's very obvious. I also really like the fact that the 15400 is just a little bit more polished up and a little bit more like jewelry on the dial. The 15400 also features a mega tapisserie dial versus the petite patisserie dial that we see on the 202. So you can see those waffle effects are much smaller and finer on the 202. Okay, so that concludes the features on these two watches, kind of comparing them. Now let's look at who is each watch for. Well, there is quite considerable price difference between these two, even retail price and aftermarket value. The aftermarket value is really where you'll see the difference in the price of these two watches. Both of these are boutique exclusive watches, so they are rare watches. They're very difficult to find. There's not very many of them out there. And this year as well, Audemars Piguet is cutting back the supply even more so these watches will be even more difficult to come by. They're absolutely stunning with their blue dials. It's an iconic Audemars Piguet Royal Oak look. And of course the original extra thin featured that same blue dial. So yeah, for those purists and people who really appreciate Audemars Piguet's history and the Royal Oak itself, then there's no substitute to these two watches. And really, if you're an ultra purist, there is no substitute to the extra thin. So if you're a purist and you don't mind a slightly smaller watch compared to today's standards, then the extra thin has no competitor. The extra thin is the extra thin. It's the ultimate Royal Oak. But there is a significant price difference. It is very thin and small compared to the standard watches like the 41mm Royal Oaks. So for those that have larger wrists and also that appreciate a slightly more sporty look and who prefer to have the second hand and the slightly more modern dimensions and style, then definitely the 15400 is the best option. It looks absolutely incredible on a much wider range of wrists, I'd say, than the 15202. Overall, which would I personally own? I think they both look incredible. They both look great on my wrist, but because I prefer slightly smaller watches than the 41mm, I much prefer a 40 or below. So ideally a 39mm if I'm looking at Audemars Piguet. Then for me, there's no substitute for my personal taste for the 202 ST. I think the extra thin is absolutely stunning. It's one of my favorite watches in the industry. It's definitely my favorite Audemars Piguet, and it's extremely comfortable and suits my wrist perfectly. So yeah, I would definitely choose the 202. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments which of these two you would choose. This is actually a very commonly asked question to us at Bijou Diamond Jewellery when we have clients considering either one of these watches. The 15202 is incredibly difficult to get and holds a massive premium, so some people sometimes go for the 15400 because it is slightly more affordable and slightly easier to get. However, that's not true anymore. The 15400 is actually extremely difficult to get now and has an extensive waiting list from Audemars Piguet direct. In fact, the waiting list on the 15400 is around 2 years and the 15202 is around 5 years. So big waiting list for these pieces, incredibly special. It's not hard to see why there's a long list of people waiting to buy these watches. So let us know in the comments which of these two you would buy or which one you'd own. Would you prefer the bigger, newer style, more modern 15400, or would you prefer the kind of more classic 15202, the extra thin? And as always, if you're interested in either of these Royal Oaks or any of the other watches in the Audemars Piguet collection, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description, and also at the end of this video, we'd be happy to call one of these watches into stock for you.